It's the shape, the color, and then the taste, if you can nibble a bit in the greengrocers, which you may not be able to. They're all clues as to the polyphenol count. So the more bitter and strong, if the leaves are loose, interestingly, that means they've had less protections from structurally, so they have to be tougher and have more chemicals in them.
If we can avoid it, we shouldn't discard the outer leaves of the lettuce and the cabbage. They often have very tender white middles, which are effectively blanched. I always think of that in terms of they've been prevented from photosynthesizing in the heart of the plant, which is often why the middle of the plant is sweeter and why traditionally you actually tie up celery and endives and things like that, because you want that white, slightly sweeter heart from a flavor point of view, but from a different flavor point of view and a health point of view, those greener, more open outer leaves have probably got more going on in them in terms of polyphenols, just as they've probably got more bitter flavors, which now we might try and cultivate that taste because we know it's good for us. Therefore, let's enjoy the bitterness of those plants and sort of find a way to relish it. Whereas traditionally, we might have been working in the garden to actually soften those bitter tastes and sweeten the plant through processes like blanching.
And Hugh, when you say bitter, I think I was brought up to believe like bitter is bad. So when you said it's bitter, it's like, well, obviously nobody wants to eat that. Are you saying like we have to just start to suffer because Tim's telling us that it's really great for our health?
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, we don't love bitter flavors immediately. From an evolutionary point of view, we really like sweet things because that's telling us that there's sugar and energy there. Many generations past, when we didn't grow food, we went and hunted it and gathered it. To be able to find something with a lot of calories in it and a lot of sweetness was something you just couldn't ignore, the energy benefit of that. So, you would risk climbing up a tree and getting stung by a lot of bees to come back with a load of honey, or you'd wait until fruit was incredibly ripe and then you'd gorge yourself on it. Nowadays, we just have access to energy through sweetness all the time. And that's what the confectionery aisle at the exit of the supermarket till is doing. And it isn't very good for us. So our relationship with foods have changed quite a lot. As to whether we should relish the bitter flavors, I mean, we can learn to love things that don't immediately taste appealing. Beer being quite a good example, I would say. If you don't like it, you don't like it, and you can't force yourself to like it. But we've come to enjoy things like rocket, which has got a hot and bitter taste. Watercress, again, hot and bitter. You probably can't eat platefuls and platefuls of that kind of stuff, but they deliver a kick. And often from a chef's point of view, it's the contrast between that bitter or hot kick and something else on the plate that's a little blander or sweeter.
Other cultures do, make it more of a thing to get that wider range of tastes in. And I think we've, in the UK and the US, really lost that.
Yeah, I think we're rediscovering it a bit, and chefs are helping us to do that. And it much in the same way as we've been a bit wary about really hot foods, where chilies are coming from, whereas other cultures have been just saying, bring it on. We have to give us as much of that as you've got. And I think it's great that, because actually a lot of these plants grow beautifully in this country. So it's great that we are diversifying our taste a little bit. And, part of that is fashion. You think, I ought to like that. So you make an effort. But actually, it ends up like the beer. You do actually enjoy it. So why not open up your mind and your taste buds and learn to relish some more unusual flavors.
And while you're on spices and chilies, the other thing to look for in you're going down the grocery aisle is, so we talked about color, we've talked about shape, we've talked about if you can, it's going to be bitter, but often the small growing tips, the tips of the leaves or the roots of the plant have the most concentrated flavors, which is also telling you they're the most concentrated chemicals. And that's where they make the herbs and the spices from.
That's because the tips of the plants are trying to ward off against nibbling flying insects, and the roots of the plants are trying to ward off against nibbling grubs and things that live in the earth.
There's something very extraordinary that the plants are making all of this stuff to protect themselves from things that are eating them. And funnily enough, we eat them and they turn out to be good for us. So there's something sort of rather magical about that.
I'd love Tim to explore that with us a tiny bit, because I feel the same. I mean, if essentially these plants are making poisons to not to kill, but to at least to ward off the flies and the bugs and the grubs in the roots, how do they end up being so good for us if the natural reaction from the predators is yuck?
Well, there's a number of theories. I mean, one is this whole idea of hormesis, which is a little bit of poison does you good. So, it's a bit like, Jonathan, if I told you to go jogging, for sort of half an hour a day, that would be poison for you. But, a little bit of it might do you good. Well, you'd probably kill me first, though. But so that's one idea. The other is, I think we're changing our views, because it's actually not us that eat the polyphenols. It's not the human that digests it. So we've got these trillions of microbes that are actually ingesting the polyphenols and converting them into other safer chemicals for us. So I think that is a really interesting, they're the middlemen.
There were things I just couldn't eat as a kid, partly because of texture, but also flavor. But I thought tomatoes were sour and uninteresting, and that mushrooms were slimy and tasted weird. Now they are two of my favorite foods. That's partly because I saw that cool chefs who I admired were doing good things with them. So I better get with the program and start liking them. But you can actually change your tastes, literally, and start enjoying things that you didn't used to enjoy.
I couldn't eat beetroot for 40 years. It was really interesting, and I love it. Absolutely. So it's
extraordinary.
You're absolutely right. And sometimes, I think school meals have got a lot to do with it. In those early years can be really quite crucial in pushing you down the wrong route if you're not careful.
I'd love to move on, because I think brilliant exposition from both of you about why plants are so good for us. But I think there is a misunderstanding, for a lot of people, like how much should we be eating? And there's this famous saying that I remember as a kid: an apple a day keeps the doctor away. And our team did some research for the show, and apparently only 10% of American adults meet the US daily recommendation for fruits and vegetables in their diet. The UK is a little better, but still only 1 in 3 meet the UK guideline, which suggests you should be eating 5 fruit and vegetables a day. So there's this huge mismatch between even the current guidelines, never mind, I think, what Tim, you might be talking about. Could you help us to understand, because you talked about like an individual plant can have this benefit, like how big a role overall should plants be playing in our diet? And where does this number 30 come from?
So I think first thing to be clear on, which isn't clear on all the guidelines, particularly the UK ones, is what constitutes a plant. So most people just think of them as fruits and veg. And that's where the UK and many other countries, 5 a day comes from, where at least one can be orange juice, which is ridiculous to have that as a core health outcome. And really, we're forgetting that nuts and seeds and herbs and spices are very much part of that mix. And that's where a lot of these outdated guidelines have gone very wrong, because it's much broader than people think. So when you're talking about 5 a day, of which one is a drink, you've only got 4 to have, which can accompany your steak. A few little accoutrements around there, and you think you've done it. Whereas the whole point is to make plants the center of the meal, and actually have the fish and the meat as optional side plates.
So interesting that. I mean, from a chef's point of view, we traditionally have, and a lot of us still do, including myself from time to time, we get very, very excited about animal protein, about meat and fish, and we make a massive fuss of it. We obsess over how we're going to marinate it, or get the skin crispy, or get the crackling. And once you've obsessed over those ingredients, you haven't got a lot of time left to think about the plant or the veg, which does then become the bit on the side. So we have to recognize that they're slightly tyrannical ingredients, meat and fish. I'm still an omnivore. I enjoy them both. But we've got to just put them on one side from time to time, and then focus on making plants delicious, which turns out not to be hard at all. Not least because from the plant kingdom, you've got the greatest variety of textures and flavors and aromas, far greater than you could ever get from the world of animal protein. I mean, a pork chop is different from a chicken drumstick, but it's not nearly as different as a walnut and a peach, or a leek and a strawberry. You know, these plants are really different from each other. And from the point of view of flavor and just being excited in the kitchen, we've got to remind ourselves of that often. And that's why a great variety of plant ingredients coming into the kitchen is exciting. We shouldn't see it as just this is what we all should be doing now for our health. It's what we ought to want to do, because it brings so much flavor and excitement into the kitchen and onto our plates.
So, Tim, I think you've done a brilliant job of explaining why, plants have this sort of health benefit, and that different plants have these different polyphenols and different fibers, so we can't just eat one. But why couldn't I still just have like a large piece of fish or meat in the center of the plate and just very little bits of, 10 different plants spread around the edge?
Well, that would certainly be better than not having any veg around the edge. Let's be clear. It isn't a binary thing. This is something we know, that if you have too much meat, particularly red meat, in very large quantities, the epidemiology suggests that starts to become bad for your health, even if it's good quality. If it's poor quality, you don't need very much at all for it to be bad all the time. Just by leaving little place on your plate for the plants, you're not really going to get enough total fiber in your diet. And we know that total fiber is very important. Magic figure is, for every 5 grams of fiber, you're going to reduce your overall risk of mortality by about 14%.
When you say reduce your chance of mortality, for like regular people listening, that's just like reduce your chance of dying by 14%.
Correct. Yes. So you reduce your risk of dying by around a sixth, just by 5 grams of fiber. And that, just to put it into context, the average US person has about 15 grams of fiber. So just increasing from 15 grams to 20 grams will give you this improvement in your lifespan.
In that case, I'd love to come on to this 30 plants a week, right? We put it in the title of the podcast. Hugh's put it in the title of his book. It's clearly like a big deal. Where does this number 30 come from?
Well, surprisingly, there aren't many studies on it, because nobody thought to actually ask people in a week how many different types of plants you ate. They used to be all lumped together. You just said, well, you just have your greens and how much fruit, how much vegetable, usually combined. So no one really cared, because they didn't think it was important. So it was the combination of the American gut study with the British gut study that came together, that I was a part of the British section. We had a combination of around 11,000 people, and a subset of those, a few thousand of them, recorded diligently everything they were eating over a week, and we compared that to their gut health profiles, and we showed that the people with the healthiest gut microbes, which we defined by diversity, sort of different types of species, we're eating the most variety of plants, and this came out at around 30. It's an approximate number, because we couldn't tell the difference between 28 or 32 or whatever, but it gives you a rough idea of these, the importance of it. It was definitely, there were gradations of it. What I found surprising in this study was that vegans and vegetarians didn't come out as having any healthier gut microbes than omnivores, people who eat meat and fish, who also ate the wide variety of plants. And I think that's a really important message, that we've been driven down this path of, subdividing of people into these groups, whereas actually we'd forgotten that the common denominator for health is not necessarily what you're avoiding, but actually what you're including in your diet. And I think this to me is the real message from those studies. And that work inspired us to do this randomized controlled trial, which we've called the biome study, because we're looking at the outcomes on the microbiome of using a prebiotic blend of over 30 different plants all put together. So we were interested what happens when you give people mainly a blend of freeze-dried plants in reasonably large amounts to produce over 5 grams of fiber, but with this variety. And so over 6 weeks, that's what we gave these volunteers, around 350 volunteers, divided into these 3 groups, one with this prebiotic blend, the other were taking really croutons, which were sort of ground up to be roughly similar. And the third group was a probiotic group that were taking a well-known probiotic that has been shown to be effective in a number of diseases. So we had these 3 groups, and over 6 weeks, the main outcome was the change in the microbiome we were looking at. And it turned out that the prebiotic blend, even the probiotic active other arm, in terms of its improvement on the gut microbiome. So we saw big changes in the good gut microbes that have been associated with good cardiometabolic health, and reductions in those microbes that have been shown to be related to poor health and poor diets. So we also showed improvements in mood and energy and reduction in hunger and a number of other parameters. So it was really exciting to see how we sort of take this epidemiological concept, which is just based on observational data, and then do a randomized controlled trial that had such convincing results. And I think that really cemented the idea that we're talking around the right ballpark. This 30, it may have been plucked out of the ether somewhat, but it, as well as the public loving it, and it's being achievable, as Hugh said, many people, it's we're going to discuss a bit more how to achieve that, but it's not that hard a goal. Many people are already doing it, and now we have a randomized controlled trial to say that diversity of plants put together have a very rapid effect on transforming many people's gut microbes.